The rebirth of Game Boy Works continues with a game that required a rebirth of its own. It's Castlevania the Adventure on Volume 2, Episode 5.
Tough break, kid. Must be rough being named after a complete butthead.
Following the arrival of the Game Boy and its initial lineup in August of 1989, only one other game shipped in the US through the end of the year. But considering that game was a handheld adaptation of one of the most popular properties on NES, I don't think a lot of kids were complaining, at least not until they played the game. If we're being totally honest here, I don't think that the concept of games as finite, fixed, start-to-finish experiences really meshed with Game Boy's underlying design philosophy anyway. At least not at this point. Look at the system's launch library and you'll see games designed for infinite replay. Back in 1989, Game Boy mostly offered sports games that emphasized unpredictable two-player dynamics. A block-breaking game created in the spirit of classic arcade experiences, which looped back to stage 1 for anyone skillful enough to master every level. And of course Tetris, a game whose mysteries and techniques the world is still working to unravel. Castlevania the Adventure does not play like those games. It belongs instead to the Super Mario Land school of game design, making a quite literal effort to live up to the Game Boy's implicit promise to be a portable NES. As on NES, the Game Boy began with light, replayable games. The rich, single-player experiences would come later, as developers got a handle on the hardware and the play patterns best suited to the system. Unfortunately, Konami did not quite have a handle on the hardware at this point, or at least that seems to be the case here. If Castlevania the Adventure reveals anything about this system, it's that we would need to wait a while for proper NES experiences on the go. Well, that's not quite true. Castlevania also reveals the growing importance of the US market in the Nintendo publisher ecosystem. Taking Nintendo's lead, developers like Konami would make an effort to get ahead here with Game Boy. The Game Boy arrived in the US less than 4 months after its Japanese launch, a stark contrast to the long localization gaps seen for NES, which was 2.5 years, Sega Genesis, which was 10 months, and TurboGrafx 16, which was nearly 2 years. Castlevania the Adventure arrives only 2 months after its October 1989 Japanese launch. Konami's decision to kick off its Game Boy publishing efforts in the States with this, rather than Motocross Maniacs, which shipped before Castlevania in Japan, says a lot about the shifting tides of the console industry. The Castlevania series did reasonably well for itself in Japan, where kids called it Akumajo Dracula, but it did gangbusters in the West. Despite this difference in reception between regions, though, Castlevania games were slow to make their way overseas following their Japanese launches, if they showed up here at all. Castlevania for NES took half a year to make its way west, and the sequel took 1.5 years. Meanwhile, Konami still hasn't shipped an official American localization of Vampire Killer, and they still peddle the 1987 arcade game Akumajo Dracula under the name Haunted Castle, as seen with the recent remake in the Castlevania Dominus collection for current-gen systems, Haunted Castle Revisited. And Castlevania the Adventure shipped in the US at the same time as Castlevania 3 arrived in Japan, a game that wouldn't make it here until September of the following year. In other words, Castlevania's quick transition to Game Boy means that Japanese publishers had gotten a better handle on what appeals to Americans after a few years of hits and misses on NES, and begun to calibrate their output and localizations accordingly. It helped, of course, that the Game Boy had a more unified hardware standard than the NES family did. Castlevania and Castlevania 2 took a while to localize because Konami had to retool their original diskette versions to run as cartridges with no built-in save file support. And Castlevania 3 would need a comprehensive overhaul as well, despite shipping in Japan as a cart, thanks to its use of a custom mapper that Nintendo outlawed in America. This wasn't a problem unique to Konami either. The NES and Famicom simply interfaced with carts and peripherals differently than one another, and they lacked cross-regional compatibility. Not so with Game Boy. Nintendo shipped a single Game Boy model worldwide, all using the same carts and peripherals and batteries. And it consolidated cartridge manufacturing under its own factories, as it had for NES games in the West, meaning that Japanese developers couldn't make use of bespoke ROM formats that would need to be reworked for America. Finally, the tiny memory size of early Game Boy games in particular meant that they required little localization to begin with, as they largely fell back on the early to mid-80s trend of incorporating English language text in their Japanese releases in order to save space. So games like Super Mario Land and, yes, Castlevania the Adventure required no real localization whatsoever, besides a different box and cartridge sticker and title screen. All of this is to say that Castlevania speaks to the continuing evolution of the console games biz in America moving into the 1990s. Prior to Game Boy's debut, the US had largely been a second consideration ever since the NES's arrival. There was clearly a ton of profit to be made here, but it took a while for companies geared towards serving the Japanese market to recalibrate their output to truly embrace the West. But Game Boy arrived as Western developers had begun to make headway on NES, and as Japanese studios increasingly created games primarily for the US. Games that never shipped on Famicom despite having been developed in Japan. From Monster Party to Strider to Sky Shark, the NES had become less of a second-run venue and more of a primary concern. And Game Boy would build on that trend with shorter lead times and a release lineup that appealed strongly to both Japanese and Western tastes. So, that's the good of Castlevania the Adventure. Unfortunately, that's about where the positives end. The game itself is pretty bad. Now, I can't call it the worst Castlevania when Haunted Castle is right there. The only reason I don't describe Haunted Castle as completely irredeemable is that M2 went and redeemed it with a revisited remake a couple of months ago. And actually, that makes a pretty good case against Castlevania the Adventure, the only other game in the series to have been so dire that M2 had to save its legacy with a remake. But Haunted Castle Revisited at least stuck to the original content of that game, indicating that Castlevania's arcade incarnation failed due to its bad controls and mechanics rather than its overall design. When M2 remade Castlevania the Adventure, they literally threw out everything about the original except some of the music and some giant rolling eyeball enemies. And you can certainly understand why they kept the soundtrack. The one piece of unqualified praise that you can direct toward Castlevania the Adventure is that it showcases the potential of the Game Boy's audio hardware better than anything Nintendo had published themselves. Sure, Tetris's Game Boy tunes have become iconic, but those amounted to fun remixes of traditional Russian folk tunes. Castlevania the Adventure gives the Game Boy's sound chip and its stereo capabilities a chance to shine, with a collection of original tunes that feel very much of a piece with the series' sonic legacy, despite it all being newly composed for this game. The soundtrack picks up elements of previous pieces from throughout the series' brief history to this point, using them almost like leitmotifs. Consider the way that the Stage 4 theme, Revenge, works the opening arpeggio of Castlevania II's Bloody Tears into its melody, or the way Stage 2's theme, Darkness, plays at reinterpreting Wicked Child into a slower, moodier piece. Although the Game Boy actually offered fewer sound channels than the NES, which in turn means that it had even fewer channels than the Disk System platform where Castlevania originated, these tunes don't feel anemic or thin compared to earlier Castlevania soundtracks. The opening stage theme, Battle of the Holy, belongs right up there with the likes of Vampire Killer and Beginning, and the ending theme provides a satisfying finale for anyone with a stomach to actually see this game through to its conclusion. Sadly, a banger of a soundtrack on a guy with a whip fighting horror movie monsters is about all the claim that Castlevania the Adventure can really lay to its franchise's legacy. Otherwise, it feels more like Castlevania by people who had never actually seen Castlevania, that even Haunted Castle did. It's like one of those medieval European paintings of animals from Africa or East Asia, which the artist had heard described or read descriptions of, but never actually seen themselves. Like, you kind of get the idea of what they were going for, but the details are all comically wrong. Anecdotally speaking, Castlevania the Adventure was the main reason I wanted to own a Game Boy back in the day. Nintendo Power's coverage of the game, which was meager but still more generous than the pitiful page inches they allocated to other Game Boy titles, made me desperate to own a Game Boy so that I could experience the successor to my beloved Castlevania and Simon's Quest for myself. And then, a few months later, playing a classmate's copy on the bus to school one morning convinced me that, maybe I didn't actually need a Game Boy after all. This isn't a completely irredeemable game, but it completely fails to capture the essence of its console predecessors. It's not just the fact that Castlevania the Adventure makes oddball changes to the series' iconography, like replacing the familiar stairways with simple ropes to climb. It's the fact that these superficial changes represent some fundamental differences in how players have to approach the action. The most notable of these is the fact that Castlevania the Adventure turns heart icons into health refills, like you'd expect from pretty much any other game. In previous Castlevania games, heart icons broke the trend by representing currency to spend at shops, or else they provided spirit energy to power the protagonist's secondary weapons. At the same time, you actually had to go looking for health refills, which only appeared rarely and always as a hidden object. They didn't drop on the regular from standard candelabras, but they do here, and with good reason. Castlevania the Adventure is a much harder game than the first two Castlevanias, packed with cheap hits and hard-to-avoid enemies. And a big part of this results from those changes to the function of the heart icons. Heart icons don't charge up your sub-weapons here because protagonist Christopher Belmont has no sub-weapons. It's just you and your whip against the Legions of Darkness, which I suppose makes him the toughest of the Belmonts, but also the least interesting to play as. The whip jump sub-weapon dynamic of the original Castlevania defined the core play concepts of the series right from the start, and helped differentiate Konami's adventure from contemporary beefy dude killing weird monster titles like Ghosts and Goblins and Rygar. When you take away the sub-weapons, you end up with a different play experience altogether. Not necessarily a bad one, but also not a true expression of Castlevania as seen in the original Nintendo game tape. What's even more vexing is the way that Castlevania the Adventure changes the fundamental behavior of the hero's whip. The actual dynamics of whip upgrades didn't truly solidify until Castlevania 3. Vampire Killer and Haunted Castle treated the whip as one of several weapon options rather than the protagonist's fixed primary form of attack, and Simon's Quest allowed you to purchase permanent upgrades. Castlevania the Adventure looks back to the original NES game by starting the hero on his quest with a short, weak leather whip that can be upgraded twice in order to gain length, hit harder, and eventually fire a ball of energy across the screen. That last detail isn't quite the way things worked in the original game, sure, but given the lack of sub-weapons like axes and boomerangs, it does at least provide the player with some form of ranged attack. Except that somewhere along the way the creators appear to have played Blaster Master and said, "Damn, what a great idea," when Jason took damage and lost both health and weapon power. As we've seen with Fester's Quest, game developers in 1989 had a bad habit of looking at the worst parts of Blaster Master for inspiration, and that manifests here in the way taking damage, any damage, causes Christopher's whip to drop a step in power. This leads to a frustrating feedback loop. Take a little damage, and you'll become less capable of fighting foes, meaning that you're likely to take additional damage as a result. It also creates an annoying disparity between health and strength. Christopher has 10 points of health, and most enemies inflict only a point or two of damage per attack. Collecting a heart refills several points of health at once. On the other hand, you can only acquire 2 steps of additional whip power, and you lose 1 per enemy attack. And the rare upgrade crystals you find along the way only boost you by a single attack point. The original Castlevania was actually quite generous with its upgrades. In addition to preset power-ups located in each stage, the game operated on a system that tied whip enhancements to collecting hearts. Once you collected 5 hearts, Castlevania would generate a power-up icon the next time you struck a candelabra that would normally drop a heart icon. By comparison, Castlevania the Adventure is downright parsimonious with its upgrades. Enhancement crystals drop rarely, and since they reworked the roll of hearts here, the 5-heart mechanic obviously doesn't factor in at all. Realistically, this means that unless you play flawlessly, you spend most of your time in Castlevania the Adventure running around in your weak, default state. The game lacks the sense of empowerment, the diversity of combat options that's always been a fundamental facet of every good Castlevania, whether in the Classicvania style or Metroidvania. I don't mean to get bogged down in the minutiae of gameplay here because that's not really my approach, but I'm afraid I've spent a non-trivial percentage of my time on this earth thinking about Castlevania, and this is how I'm going to have to exercise those demons. So, the basic inconsistencies between Castlevania the Adventure and optimal Castlevania make for a game that just isn't fun to play. It probably wouldn't even be too bad an experience if Christopher moved like other Belmonts, but the game falls short here too. Not only does the action feel like it's running at half speed, but the hero's jumps have a shallow arc that doesn't pair well with the unforgiving platform edges. A big part of Castlevania NES's mechanical success came down to the crisp precision of Simon's leaps. Yes, Castlevania used the same rigid aerial arc physics as Ghosts and Goblins, which can often feel punishing, but the entire game world revolved around the way Simon leapt. There was a beautiful consistency and predictability to the action in the NES Castlevania games that never left you in doubt about where you were going to land. And the programming tended to be pretty generous about how Simon stood and landed on blocks. Not so here, and the hardest part of this game is, without question, the punishing design of the jump mechanics. It doesn't quite demand pixel-perfect action, but it comes damn close, which is a pretty bold choice considering the jankiness of the Game Boy screen in its original form. Now, there are 2 logical conclusions that might explain the fact that Castlevania the Adventure is a slow-paced, relentlessly unforgiving slog with hateful design and fundamentally un-Castlevania-like mechanics. First, the fact that this is one of the first console-style action games ever to arrive on a portable system, and no one really knew what they were doing yet. The other is that, as in Super Mario Land, the actual amount of content in Castlevania the Adventure pales in comparison to the size of stages seen in a much older console iteration of the series. With 4 stages, each of which covers less ground than the levels in Castlevania for NES, this is only about half as much game as that original title. Making it play at half speed while being incredibly difficult to complete would certainly be one way to stretch this meager amount of material to create the illusion of a full game. Not a good way, mind you, but certainly there have been more unscrupulous approaches to padding material. But I don't think either of these theories really gets to what's going on with Castlevania the Adventure. Sure, it's a small game, and as the first third-party release for Game Boy in America, it's reasonable to think that the creators were still learning the ins and outs of Nintendo's new handheld. But nah, I think we can pin the way Castlevania the Adventure turned out to the creative team behind it, specifically Masato Maezawa and Nobuya Nakazato. Back when I first covered this game in Game Boy World a decade ago, I said that Castlevania the Adventure turned out the way it did despite the involvement of these guys, who would go on to have a hand in some of the most beloved games of the 16-bit era. In hindsight, though, I realized that this was an inaccurate assessment. In truth, I think Castlevania the Adventure turned out this way because of the involvement of these guys. Maezawa and Nakazato would go on to direct games like Contra Hardcore, Gunstar Heroes, Rocket Knight Adventure, and Bangayo. These are designers who truly have their own particular tastes and idiosyncratic tendencies. Their CVs lack much in the way of by-the-numbers design, even when they've worked on sequels to established franchises. They like to make their games their own way, to their own tastes. So I have to think that when the assignment came down to make a Castlevania sequel for Game Boy, the follow-up to someone else's project, they had more than enough talent to crank out a pretty faithful take on the NES games. That would have been boring for them, so they reinvented Castlevania to be weirder, harder, and more demanding. You can't fault the impulse, but unfortunately Maezawa and Nakazato aren't infallible, and sometimes they follow those quirky impulses to the ultimate detriment of their work. Castlevania the Adventure does impress in the context of its time, a game that kind of resembles Castlevania on a portable system much more convincingly than Tiger Electronics' LCD Simon's Quest handheld. But it doesn't hold up to the test of time, and it certainly doesn't live up to the Castlevania console legacy. Well, except musically. It does, however, demonstrate the challenges that lay ahead for developers who want to bring their NES experiences to Game Boy. A fraught, but not necessarily futile task. And it also underscores the fact that Castlevania had a tough formula to mess with, as attempts to deviate from the NES game's design could just as often result in a flop as in a work of art. Anyway, it's not the best foot forward for Konami, or the strongest finale for Game Boy's lineup for the year. But what else were you gonna do for portable entertainment, you little Nintendo nerd living in 1989? Play Electro Cop? Give me a break. Next time on Game Boy Works, we flip the odometer on the calendar and venture into the world of 1990.